We have the pleasure of having experts to come and talk to us a little about trees and the Decatur community. And I wanted to first introduce those panelists. Dr. Jacqueline Eccles, Board President of South River Watershed Alliance. Howard Katzman, former builder and earthquake technical advisor. Amy Landesberg, Decatur architect and lead AP BDNC. And Catherine Kolb, executive director of Eco Addendum and tree ordinance consultant. So they're going to have a seat down, and they have a presentation that they've put together as the four of them that they'll come up and present over time. And then we'll do questions. We will have some folks over in the corners with cards. If you have questions as the presentation goes on, or even pre-presentation or after presentation, just signal to them. They can give you a card. You'll fill those out, and then I'll moderate by asking your questions to the panelists. You can direct it to one of the panelists, so just put their name and then your question, or it can just be a general question for the panelists, in which case you don't need to have any name with it. So with that, we'll get started.
Okay, very good. Thank you all so much for coming out. We'll just kind of get right into this. So how to sustain Decatur's trees and urban forest as a part of the development process. So the first thing we can talk about is, why is our urban forest so special? We've heard that Atlanta metro area is sitting in the forest. So why do we have a special forest? Well, if you look at this map, these are the different areas that were ceded from the Muskogee Creeks and then later the Cherokee to the American government. Our area is in 1821. When we say Atlanta, that's the Atlanta metro area. We built out very, very late in the game for a major city. Most of our major cities were built out 100 or even 200 years before ours. So we were an old growth forest way into the 1800s, and our growth really didn't come about until the 1960s after air conditioning. So as a point of comparison, these are the different cities all at the same scale, showing the amount of built structure, impervious surface to green space. That's New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Houston, and Atlanta. So that is just, anyone can go to Google Earth and see that, and you can see Decatur there over on the right side. The silver lining of our sprawl development is that we have pockets of green space that still exists in the urban core. We didn't build out densely like these other cities. We built in a sprawl model, so the benefit of that is pockets of green space still exist that go back to that older forest from the Muskogee Creek days, the original forest of our region. So where do we find these pieces of forest? And this can be, old growth trees, individual trees, or special forest areas. Steep slopes. We're a city of hills, Druid Hills. Steep slopes were not farmed, and so they weren't built out, weren't even considered to be buildable until very recently. Stream corridors, especially with narrow floodplains. Rocky places weren't farmed, and historic properties, and obviously memorial sites. And then, very importantly, our older neighborhoods. Our older neighborhoods, the houses had foundations. They were built to grade. You didn't grade the land. And the trees that were built before the 1950s were usually left for shade. And those are still in our older neighborhoods today. So here's an example. This is the UMCH property. This tree actually had some damage, and it needed to be cut. But there's about 6 or 7 other older trees all up in this area. We went ahead and we counted the rings when it was cut. Turns out that was 190 years old. We have trees like that around in our backyards and in our neighborhoods. We call it sort of hiding in plain sight. This is just a few blocks actually in East Lake neighborhood, but next door to Decatur. 30-inch post oak, not very big, not very grand looking, got some ivy on it in the backyard. Plan reviewers allowed it to be cut down, even though it's in the setback, and it was 280 years old. 280 years old is beginning to get back. As a reference point, this is what 280 years old looks like. This was a fashionable men's portrait that time, so that tree was growing when this portrait was done. This is what Savannah looked like 280 years when that tree in our neighborhood started to grow. Savannah was nothing but a clearing in the trees. It was trees all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. And those trees that grew up in that forest are still found in our neighborhoods. So one of the things that we find a very special part of having older trees in neighborhoods is the soils. Soils are really important. Soils are what generate a healthy urban forest and make trees healthy and are able to continue that forest. So this is an older tree, probably 170, 200 years old. It's right next to a house. It's right next to a garage. This soil sample was taken right behind that garage. It's 18 inches of rich, old-growth soil. It's very unusual. Usually when you do a soil sample, you get about 2 or 3 inches of topsoil that goes right to clay. So that's one of the things that we have in our neighborhoods in Metro Atlanta, very special, is older soils. So cutting a tree is not the worst thing for a forest. If we take out a few trees out of the forest, that forest will regenerate itself. When you take the soils out, you'll never get it back. And one of the reasons is because these graded clay soils contain very high levels of aluminum, which is in fact toxic to tree roots. We plant these trees in these terrible locations, we expect them to grow, and they often don't do very well. So when we do aerial studies or satellite data of our urban canopy, we say, oh, well, we have all this canopy, but all canopy is not the same. This is what we would call low-value canopy. It's not giving us really any ecosystem services, and it's not really giving us any green infrastructure services compared to this canopy, which is giving us full ecosystem services and also giving us stormwater, all these other values for our green infrastructure. So we've all seen this. The new trend now is to do teardowns. When we do these teardowns, what we're seeing now is we're taking the trees out of the backyards and the side yards, and that's where most of our canopy lives, is in backyards and side yards. And when we grade lot line to lot line, we're losing that. This is actually a photograph taken in Winona Park, which then became this. And so the interesting thing that we're seeing changing also is, we had a fairly decent sized house, probably housing 2 to 4 residents. So but we still have a lot of our landscape left. We call this false density because we're having a much higher impact to the landscape, but we're not really getting any more residents. So we're getting a higher footprint, a disturbed footprint. We're losing our canopy, but we're not really housing any more people. And then when we look at how we're kind of replacing our canopy, on the left, these are the kind of trees that we have in our neighborhoods. And if you see, these are small trees that have just been replanted along the street here. We're kind of replacing our older trees in our neighborhood yards with trees, along the street. And it's great, that we plant trees, but they're really never going to give us the values of those older trees. And then when we lose trees, basically we're getting a large amount of stormwater. We're getting more impervious surface. So just to be very quick here, in a Houston study, Houston increased their impervious area by 25% in a 15-year period. And they figured that the flooding damage cost about $4,000 per square meter of impervious surface. And that was before Hurricane Harvey. I did this slide before Hurricane Harvey. So when we're losing our trees, we're really starting to increase our stormwater and all the costs associated with it. And at this point, I will introduce Jackie Eccles, who will talk about stormwater. Oh, she won't. Oh, sorry. I'm going to continue. Oh, sorry, we changed the order of that. So I will keep going. So we got stormwater issues, so kind of the elephant in the room here, which we're all kind of aware of, and this is true for all of Metro Atlanta. About 95% of our trees and urban forests is on private property, and it's pretty much always going to be that way. You know, we can buy parks and things like that, but about 80% of that is going to be in single-family residential property. So what are our options? Replanting trees is great when we can do it, but we're never going to be able to replant our way out of 90 or 80 to 90% of our forest. Purchasing green space is fabulous, but again, we're never going to be able to buy enough. Even if, for instance, City of Atlanta were to double its parks, buy enough property to double its parkland, we would still have about 90% of our trees and urban forest on private property. So what governs trees on private property is the tree ordinance, and that's why we're here tonight, and that's why many of the jurisdictions in Metro Atlanta are looking at tree ordinances now. So how do we address this? A number of people have vetted what we are calling the 4-step plan, which is a lot of common sense, and we think this can work. The first thing we have to do is plan for trees from the beginning. You can't go through a whole process, get permits, do a design, have architectural drafts and all of that, and then at the end of the day say, well, we'd like you to save this tree. That's really not realistic. So what we need to do is put trees at the beginning of the process. If we do that, which trees do we save? We can't save all our trees. Let's figure out the best trees. And so what we've developed is a tree value matrix and also some other forest assessment tools so that we can identify the best trees to save. Then the next sort of step in that is a sustainable footprint. When we're grading lot line to lot line and doing very large amounts of impervious coverage, there's obviously not going to be any room left for trees. You can't save trees unless you save the ground in which they stand. We all kind of know that, but we forget that sometimes. And then effective enforcement. You need enforcement that deters code violations. So the sustainable footprint, we've worked a lot on this, and what we have is a new plan where the sustainable footprint can actually dovetail with stormwater requirements. So if our sustainable footprint basically matches the area in a lot that you could build out before you have to do stormwater detention, we very neatly tie those things together. And if anyone wants to talk more in detail about that, we think this is a really good way of addressing this issue. That also creates an even playing field for builders. It applies to all properties, so people that have trees on their property don't actually suffer some sort of disadvantage for having trees. It applies across the board because stormwater is a problem for everybody, and it's a big cost to cities. The sustainable footprint also supports affordable and diverse price point housing because people may have a smaller, footprint, and they may just have a story, or they may get their square footage by going up, or they may choose to renovate a house rather than going ahead and grading the whole lot. So when we have a sustainable footprint, that really encourages a lot of diverse answers to how to build, and we would build to individual lots, not sort of this scrape and grade trend that we see now. It also mitigates gentrification, and it slows the steep rises in taxes because when we do scrape and grade, where we clear the whole lot, put up a really large structure at very high cost, then whole neighborhoods turn. We don't have diverse price point housing, and then those taxes rise for everyone, and some people can no longer afford to stay in their neighborhoods. Socioeconomic pressures that result in excessive tree loss are often the same pressures that harm, particularly people in vulnerable communities. There are some benefits of trees, and we don't need to go into all of that. A lot of times we know what those are, but there's some things that kind of fly under the radar. They've done a lot of studies. Living near a green space can help you be more healthy. You can have less chance of dying of 12 different diseases if you live within a half a mile of a green space, even if you never set foot in that green space. Some of these things can be measured. Living near trees and green space can actually equal a $20,000 boost in income for typically people with higher income or healthier, but it's if you live near trees and green space, that actually serves as a pretty significant benefit. There's a lot of tree preservation can save costs for public, private costs for health and safety, often associated with physical and mental health. Tree loss actually creates higher tax burdens for city infrastructure. Jackie's going to talk more about that. And it also, as we said before, can force residents to leave neighborhoods. So here's just an example. This is in City of Atlanta, kind of a win-win. City of Atlanta has a process where you can actually appeal decisions by the city arborist. Developer, in this case, this is over in Kirkwood, wanted to take down a very large southern red oak, one of these older ones, probably 175 or something like that, significant older tree. Neighbors appealed. Some of the neighbors were architects. They actually showed how the house could basically just be scooched over a few feet, and you could save enough of the critical root zone to save that tree. And so the tree commission upheld the appeal. So we built the house. The tree is saved. House sells in about 2 weeks for $600,000. So we can do this. It's possible. And then this is another option, just shown very quickly, of cluster design, where we actually cluster houses on a property instead of doing a kind of a typical subdivision where we divide up the whole property equally and bulldoze most of that area and flatten it out to create equidistant lots and so forth. We actually cluster the houses. This is East Lake Commons, done by Greg Ramsey with Village Habitat Design. And so we've got a lake and an organic farm and a woodland and a stream, and we've got the same number of houses, so it's density neutral. So there's a lot of things that we can do to work with trees. And thanks very much. We've got some other speakers coming right up.
My name is Jackie Eccles, and I am board president for the South River Watershed Alliance. And I want to talk just a few minutes about trees as stormwater infrastructure. You know, an idea that seems to be lost on a lot of cities, counties. You know, they just don't seem to get the idea. I know I read kind of an article about your stormwater utility meeting you had, I guess, last week, and the discussion about increases in costs, how much are you willing to pay for stormwater management, those kinds of questions. But I can pretty much assume that the stormwater that they were talking about is not mixed with sanitary sewage. And so that's the big difference between that conversation and this conversation. As you probably know, DeKalb County is under a federal consent decree. It has been since 2010. It expires, this particular consent decree expires in June 2020. DeKalb County will not make that deadline. The consent decree will be extended. It will not be done in 5 more years. We're looking probably more at 15, 20 years, if not even longer than that. So the whole sanitary sewage issue, stormwater issue, the DeKalb County consent decree issue is with us for a very long time. So the consent decree is about eliminating sanitary sewage spills that pollute our creeks and rivers, which are every single one, is a violation of the U.S. Clean Water Act. This means that the entire county, that means every city, is on the hook for this consent decree. It may be that that CEO Thurman, because he's CEO of DeKalb County, is kind of at the forefront, but all of the cities, new cities, old cities, will bear the cost of this fix. There's just no way to get around it. So, DeKalb County has a capacity problem. No matter what you hear, DeKalb County has a capacity issue. Inadequate sewer infrastructure capacity is due to growth. That's true. But it's also due to infiltration and ingress of stormwater into the sewer pipe infrastructure. That's where the problem lies. And the only way to fix a leaky sewer is to fix the leaky sewer. You know, you can't ignore it. It won't fix itself. That's just how it is. I&I is made worse by more frequent, heavier, and longer duration rains. And you couple that with development that routinely takes down trees and cover that area with impervious surface, you're just exacerbating the problem. There are huge tangible costs in the form of environmental degradation and destruction, as well as public health and quality of life consequences. This is Shoal Creek. The city of Decatur sits on top of Shoal Creek. It used to be free flowing and open. It's been covered over pipe many years ago. This is a shot of the creek at somewhere Oakhurst. This is the site of Shoal Creek, not far down the river off of Memorial Drive, at 1615 Melody Court. That site overflows almost every time there's a rain of any degree measure in the city of Decatur. All the stormwater that falls on the city of Decatur runs down primarily Shoal Creek. It is the drainage creek for, as I said, for Decatur. It's had 32, this particular site, that's Shoal Creek in the background, by the way. This photo was taken on April 19th when we had that rainstorm. There have been 32 major spills, that's 10,000 gallons or more at that site since 2014, and as many minor spills. So these are the issues that stormwater contribute to. I&I, which means that the stormwater infiltrates the pipe. It's already under capacity, so what you're going to end up with every time is a sanitary sewer spill. These are this is an example again of some of the spills. Just look at the amounts. And again, this is the result of taking trees down from lots and covering them with impervious surfaces. And the stormwater has nowhere to go but down the street, into storm drains, into leaky pipes, and these are the kinds of problems that you end up with. And you know, Shoal Creek is about 8 miles long, so it ends up pretty much at the South River. And so you see from downtown Decatur to Flat Shoals Road, where Shoals Creek runs into the South River. Those numbers are just staggering in terms of gallons of sewage. Developers clear areas for development are required to plan ways to manage rainwater, but are not required to consider water uptake by trees as a factor in those plans. And that's something that needs to happen. You have to consider how you're contributing to the problem, because the cost of that problem is passed on to everybody in this room. Fixing sewers is not cheap. The cab hasn't even started. The $300 million that the CEO is talking about is a drop in the bucket. So there has got to be, as part of this conversation, and maybe you all can take the message to your mayor or the council of how these costs are being passed on to everyone what is actually caused by the developer, and that individual has the wherewithal to have a serious impact on what you pay. This actually shows how much an inch of rain creates in gallons of rain that hits the ground. So you can see the magnitude of the problem. The vast majority of single-family homes, in terms of square footage and impervious surface, falls outside of the requirement to have on-site retention. So that doesn't help the average. It doesn't affect the average house that's built. And to wrap up, tree foliage reduces the erosive impact of raindrops. It's not just the tree, it's even the leaves. More than a fifth of the rainfall reaching a tree each year can be held in its leaves and branches. And most folks don't think about that. Finally, a single mature tree might intercept anywhere from 760 gallons to 4,000 gallons of water annually, depending on the species of the tree. And a tree can hold water back from the sewer for hours until it can percolate through the ground. So a lot of benefits there. And it can be done. We are not talking about something that cannot be done. This is doable. You just have to have the will and the wherewithal, and representatives and politicians who are willing to step up and hold folks who are accountable for addressing this issue. They're passing the buck on to ratepayers. It could be mitigated by including trees in their plans. Stormwater should be addressed on site first. And as Catherine said, we cannot replant or pay our way out of this problem. We've got to find a way. Folks have got to have the wherewithal to address infrastructure, trees as infrastructure on development sites. That's it.
Am I speaking into the microphone? I can't tell.
That's closer to you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Well, one way that could be accomplished maybe is if we have a cultural change. And the reason I pictured this oceanfront community in Great Beach, Florida, is the way we value beaches and oceans and major bodies of water are as profound environmental circumstances for which we build correctly. We understand that we have shared land that has to be used properly. We have to design the way the environment needs us to design. Is it the right button?
Yes.
Not really. Yeah. I went back, so let's try that. It's a conspiracy. Well, the forward button isn't working right now. Yay! Okay. Thank you. So if we consider our forest, like those who live near the ocean consider the ocean, we would behave differently. So you've seen some before and afters. I want to talk a little bit specifically about recent construction in Decatur, some really good, promising projects, some disastrous projects, and how we might look at that. So this is just outside the city of Decatur. This is before on South Columbia, the forest in the main part of that shot towards the top. That's after. Okay? That's before on Parkwood. That's after. That's before on Glen Circle. That's after. Okay, so it's happening everywhere as the previous presenters have said. Now, this is pretty good news. This is before on Mount Vernon. You see those two big trees in the front yard, and you see the sort of wooded area in the back. Zoning worked for trees in this condition. I imagine it was the front yard setback that kept the building construction where it's going to be. That's what's going on now. So the forest area in the back is the same, the trees are the same in the front, and the new construction is happening in the area of the existing building's footprint. Good news. Here's another really good one, and I want to go into some detail about this to show you the implications of our current ordinance in Decatur. This is 655 West Ponce Leon Avenue. This is on Trinity at the curve near, Ponce at the curve near Trinity. This is a before picture, and this is the survey, okay, of that land with the trees shown. Now there's a few, this is considered by the arborists to be about 89% canopy at the time of the survey. One tree was very sick, a 33-inch oak that had to be taken down. So it might not be quite 89%, but the survey includes trees around the boundary, not only on this property, and you'll see why that's important in a minute. So this is after, okay? There's virtually no change to the trees in this construction. This is the Harry family, was sort of dedicated to trying to build without. They loved the trees on the site. That's one reason they bought the lot. Richard M. Stevens, the architect, Century Craft Homes, they've been very caring in every way for the property. So this is before and after, okay? So there is really hardly any difference in the canopy. That 133-inch oak, I don't have a pointer near the pool, would have to be removed, okay? Now, they're doubling the square footage, so they're getting the big house that people seem to want. There's only a little bit of expansion. The hatched area on the, I put before on both of them, I'm sorry. The one on the right is after, so they're doing 2 stories, but it's basically the same footprint with an expanded porch. So it's just twice, it's the same basic width and depth, and it's twice as tall. And so here's some of the things that could have taken place, okay? Now, in the current ordinance, you're allowed to get a benefit from trees that are not on your property if the canopy is shading your property. So there's a ton of trees on this land, but if there were not, this land would be getting credit from the green areas, which are not significant in the front, but in the back, that's quite a bit of square footage. Okay, and so this homeowner has no control over those trees, yet they would be contributing to the required canopy on this lot. Now, the current code requires that you save 25% of the existing canopy on a lot. So what you see is the way it could have been on the right, okay, without any variance or any problem. So if the Harrys had just simply chosen to cut down all those trees, they could have. And then 18 months later, the code would have allowed them to take 3 more trees down for any reason of any kind. Now, if originally they had decided to conserve specimen trees, or trees that the city's ordinance considers of high value, they would get double credit for them. So that's all they would have had to keep to make that 25%, because it would really only have to have been 12.5%. Now, if they were in total violation and had clear cut illegally, they would pay a fine. Unfortunately, the economics indicator doesn't really make that a significant problem. But they would have been required to replace trees that, when mature, would become 25% coverage. So they could have planted that, okay? So this is a wonderful story about the Harry family and the design team and the construction team, but that's how it could have gone. So that's what I wanted to tell you.
about the builder's point of view a little. So builders vary in their concerns, but to prosper, they all have to make a profit. And basically, they're working backwards from the selling price. And there's an appraised value that they're usually working from, because if they're getting a loan from a bank, the bank is going to look at what the maximum selling price could be, and then they're going to try to control their costs and hopefully control unforeseen circumstances to minimize expenses beyond what they know they have to do to build a home. And that's the environment that they work in. At the same time, if we can level the playing field, as Catherine was talking about, so all builders have the same requirements and restrictions, then they're not going to feel like they're being unfairly penalized. Builders seem to really just, in the final analysis, they're so busy, and the process is such a demanding one for most builders that whatever gets worked out is as a legal requirement. Basically, builders need to know what they just need you to tell them, or the municipality to tell them what they need to know, and then they'll just build to that, and they know that they're not in any unfair situations compared to anybody else. So the one option could be to look at, or a requirement could be smaller footprints, given the sustainable footprint and the tree matrix that Catherine talked about. And that means that some lots, because of the value of those trees, are going to only be allowed to build to that smaller footprint. For those of you who aren't familiar with Sarah Susanka, this is one example I give of an architect now with a national reputation, who has written extensively about how to build smaller, higher quality homes, and have spaces within the homes that typically are multi-purpose, have higher levels of finish. And it's a way to build smaller, but yet still have the value and the features that people want. So these are some more pictures of some of the spaces from her homes. Here's another example of a household, of a house that's a 3-bedroom, 3-bath. From my anecdotal experience, the majority of the new households I see moving into Decatur, into new homes, typically are 2 to 4 people per household. Yet I see many homes built to 4 or 5 bedrooms. What Sarah has are designs that can fit on a smaller footprint. Maybe they don't have quite that square footage, but they would have a higher quality space. And here are a couple. Here's the first floor footprint of the picture on the previous slide. So it's still got nice spaces in it. Still got a nice eat-in kitchen and dining and living spaces, and even a multi-purpose room there. And then the second floor shows 3 bedrooms, generous spaces, common spaces, and so forth. So builders typically look at the larger square footage as a way to maximize their profit. If the appraised values in the neighborhood are going up and other people are building larger homes, then they're going to want to build as large as possible to get as close to the maximum price as their competitors. But the value of smaller homes with quality design and finishes need not necessarily be lower in value. And the function, the value is really a function of location and the house's features. It's not just, it doesn't have to be pure square footage. And people, another thing to think about is that as a family's life cycle shifts and children grow up and leave, many people, and I know this from personal experience, and you may too, as people are aging and they're now empty nesters or whatever, they're less inclined to stay in a very large home than if the home is smaller and easier to maintain, easier to handle and so forth. So I think aging in place becomes more possible with smaller sized homes. Another thing I wanted to talk about was this idea of limiting the lot sizes, the building sizes, and the disturbance of soil that Catherine showed so well in her slides. One thing to consider is to limit when let's say when a house is torn down that may have had a crawl space with a dugout area, full height maybe for a water heater in the basement that you see a lot in older homes in Decatur. If the new home that's built if the basement area is limited to that size footprint, then we're really limiting the amount of disturbance. And if the footprint of the whole house enlarges, how about building it with crawl space or even on piers, which is not something that's unusual. This was done earlier in the 20th century in homes all through Georgia, and it certainly allows a builder to build on a lot, reduce the amount of clearing and topsoil destruction that we see so commonly today. Finally, the idea of crawl spaces typically have been very unpleasant spaces in homes, and when they're built as encapsulated crawl spaces, which you see in the separate photo, they're actually healthier than the standard vented crawl space, and they're actually far more energy efficient. So that ends all of our slides and presentation, and I guess we're ready to take some questions. Should we all come up?
Maybe we can just sit here and pass the pass.
So if you have questions and you haven't turned in cards yet, then let people know on the sides so that they can feed questions. And I wanted to also, now that we're not quite so rushed to get started, make a couple mentions that the Decatur First United Methodist Church Creation Care Committee and Trees Atlanta are the sponsors of this event. And I wanted to acknowledge Beth Bond, who's president of the Creation Care Committee, and Judy Yee, who's the director of education for Trees Atlanta. Trees Atlanta has got a number of different events going on. So if you're not on their mailing list, make sure that you talk to Judy to get on their mailing list and find out some of the other events that they've got going on. I also want to acknowledge the Environmental Sustainability Board here, Stephen Blackburn and Susan Montgomery, and Decatur City Commissioner Kelly Walsh. I know that there were some other city commissioners that are at the Oakhurst Neighborhood Association meeting today, so they couldn't make it because it's at the same time. And also acknowledge Decatur Deputy City Manager Hugh Saxon. At the chance of missing somebody, if I didn't name you, you can come see me or send a note to one of the people on the side. Okay, so we'll start out with some of the questions that we have. So Amy, the city regulates the buildable area, but is there any regulation to the area of disturbance? And if not, how hard would that be to implement?
Gosh, Hugh could answer that question better than I can. Well, the disturbed area would be limited. I guess you can I'm not sure. Okay, I'm not sure, but I do know that if you disturb 10,000 feet, you trip detention. But I'm not aware of other restrictions to disturbance than that, besides the 25% canopy that needs to be maintained. So I may be answering that, I may not be answering that question, but I'd be glad to try to look into it.
For Amy and Howard, is it true what you hear from some developers that saving trees makes houses too expensive?
I haven't heard that from developers. I think that one problem we have is that if a development company uses more or less stock plans that don't change very much except for their site adaptation, then it can be quite expensive for them to change their mode of approach. However, I think that is because it is the wrong approach. With additions, major additions, new construction, or renovations that are site-specific, designed for the site, then I think there is some risk of a slight increase in cost because might be more perimeter. The most efficient building shape for cost-wise, Howard, tell me if I'm right, is to have as little perimeter as possible. So if your company makes, you have 5 or 6 types that you build, and they all have more or less square footprint perimeters, and you put them on a lot where the trees cause a zigzag, you have to take out trees if your economic model that is based on that type is going to be maintained. So that, I assume, is what the issue is, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? Okay, so if you don't approach it that way, if you approach it that each site is a unique design solution to be made, even within historic standards, with the exception of perhaps having to do more perimeter to get your square footage to work around natural conditions, I would say that the answer is that the problem is completely solvable. Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I would only add that it depends on the builder, of course. Not everyone is using stock plans. And I see a number of, frankly, some very nicely designed homes in Decatur being individually designed by architects, right? And most of those are fairly complex designs. They're not necessarily that cheap to build to begin with. And I actually have faith in architects if they're going to be challenged to build to a more unique site because we're trying to keep trees and reduce site disturbance. I have faith in the creativity of architects to rise to that challenge and build us even more beautiful homes.
Hang on to that microphone. This is a clarifying question that came. Howard, what's an encapsulated crawl space?
The typical crawl space you see on older homes in Decatur has got vents in the walls. So there's typically bare dirt in there. They're not pleasant spaces. They're full of bugs. They're full of water often. And the unpleasantness in those crawl spaces can easily be communicated up into the house through the air leakage. Whereas with an encapsulated crawl space, it's really like a short basement where you seal it up, you insulate the walls, you condition it, and you saw that picture I had with the white plastic down. It actually becomes more of an asset to the home than a detriment.
Okay, this is a question that's come up on a couple of these questions. Who do we talk to about changing the codes for buildings and tree removals? For example, in this question, if people wanted to build with a different building material, I hear that's better for the root system. So how might something like that start?
That's interesting.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, I think it it actually comes down to creating regulations that work or work as good as possible, and then just, and I can't put this any more gingerly, you know, letting developers know these are the parameters within which you have to work to save tree canopy, to address stormwater issues, to address stormwater infrastructure issues, and you move from there. I think as long as we try, and I think time bears the statement out, we try to accommodate every idea, every notion, every fear, every dollar, you will never get there. And that's true in Decatur, that's true in the city of Atlanta where I live. That's just the reality of that. I mean, the zoning departments, representatives, all the folks that are responsible, arborists that are responsible for this at the direction of a leader, whoever they may be, and the municipality, to come up with a solution.
I'll just add a little bit to that. I think that a lot of times these types of codes are not very publicly interesting. They're kind of boring to work through 40 pages of, 6 feet here and 2 feet there, and people's eyes glaze over. And I think that there's a kind of a fatigue that sets in, and people are like, oh, let's just get this done and send it off. It's not necessarily going to work, but let's just have it be done because we're tired of looking at it. And I think that there's an opportunity with a lot of people in the community who have a lot of expertise that are looking at some of that here, and there's lots of other people who are willing to roll up their sleeves and contribute to solutions that work. And some of these have been presented today, and I think there's a real opportunity to, make a little bit of a paradigm shift to create regulations that are really going to protect our communities for the future. If we don't do that, the whole metro area is undergoing another extremely large growth boom, and that's just what's happening. If we don't control that in a way that makes sense, our communities are going to change. It's not going to be like this anymore. We're going to create that densification that other cities did in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and we don't have the infrastructure to support it. We don't have water infrastructure. The Chattahoochee River. We don't live on the Hudson River. We're not going to be able to make this work the way some of those other cities did. So I think we really need to be serious about it, not treat it like something that we don't pay much attention to, but really take long-term planning and the regulations that make it work seriously. So I was just going to say one other comment. There's a lot of conferences that people go to, people in this room go to. Everybody has a nice little sandwich and a cup of coffee, and we talk about these really great progressive ideas and how to plan and how to have, cities that have greenery and our urban forests. And then when it comes down to the code, what really happens where the rubber meets the road is the same old stuff that we've been doing since the 1970s. So I think there's an opportunity to shift.
This one's for all the panel members. What about affordable housing? How do we save trees and have affordable housing?
Well, I think that Howard and Catherine both addressed that in their presentations. Therefore, I think they should answer the question. But sustainable footprints requiring buildings to be smaller should help lower cost properties maintain their value as property as opposed to land. I mean, as homes as opposed to land. So if you have if there's a little house on a little lot, and the house is a lot is cleared next to it, and a giant house goes on it, your house becomes a real estate asset, not a home anymore, okay? So I think that if we can reverse that trend where the neighborhoods are being crushed, as Catherine pointed out, by accelerated values, then most neighborhoods could stay intact longer and stay more affordable. If a city that you could maybe imagine, started to require very stringent tree protections and building footprints got smaller, perhaps the cost of housing would go down, and those who really had to have 6 and 5 or 5 and 6 or whatever it is, plus, an outbuilding that houses 3 might go elsewhere, and the neighborhood might not, could sustain pricing at a more reasonable level. But maybe not, because it would be such a desirable area that people would pay more for those houses. So we have a sort of systemic problem in that area that can't be solved only by tree regulation.
Jackie, this.
The City of Atlanta recently passed a change to their zoning allowing accessory dwelling units in the backyards. And Decatur has it. The question is, and that's maybe the best opportunity in neighborhoods of high real estate values to get some smaller living units. The question is, if people are trying to rent them at the maximum economic value, that may exceed that might kick them out of the affordability category. But certainly that is one option.
I think those are, there's another affordability problem that's built into that, which is Airbnb. Okay, so that it becomes very difficult for long-term long-term rentals to be feasible.
Yeah, I'd like to just make a couple of comments. One is if the code says that you can create this very large footprint and grade your entire property, what you will always have is value by square footage, and every time a property turns, you're going to get a very large footprint. If we say that we're going to have a sustainable footprint, and that leaves us a little bit of room, can't save all the trees, but we can save our better trees, we create a sustainable footprint, then you can have a one-story house with a smaller footprint, maybe it has a smaller square footage, but we can have a two-story house that has a larger square footage. So you can still get that value. You can have houses built to individual lots so that you can build in those higher values. So what you do is you create the opportunity for diverse price points. If you don't create that sustainable footprint, you're never going to create that incentive for diverse answers to how to build on lots. I want to just make a little bit of a comment about these accessory structures. When we add these accessory dwellings to an already large home, and we don't have it, if we have a sustainable footprint, you could have a small home and a large accessory structure, or 2 small ones, or something like that. But when we add an accessory structure to already a large footprint home, we're actually getting the opposite result, because those accessory structures are built in as a financial amenity so that people can afford that big expensive house. And often that's going to Airbnb. So what we're doing is we're actually supporting an increase in house prices with these accessory structures. And think about how this is going to be in our community. Workforce families are not going to live in an accessory structure in the back of somebody's big house. That's culturally really not going to happen. So I think we need to really carefully consider these accessory structures, because when we add them to an already large footprint house, we're clearing that whole entire lot.
This question has to do with climate change. So scientists have told us we have about 12 years, and that was a year ago almost now, to deal with, in a major way, climate change. So why is the time now to make improvements in the context of climate change?
Okay, so
question saying 12 years is a long time. um, Climate change is here now. I mean, that's just a reality. The duration of rain events, the weeks on end of rain, it's here now. And as I said it in my presentation, all cities are struggling with bad infrastructure. I won't say all, most. If they're at any age, when you get 50, 60-year-old pipes, they're going to start to leak. So it's not just City of Decatur, it's not just City of Atlanta. They're all dealing with that. Now, the problem with infrastructure is that you don't see it. Out of sight, out of mind. But the requirement is, particularly under the Clean Water Act, that issues with infrastructure have to be addressed because we cannot allow sanitary sewage to mix with stormwater and get discharged in waters and parks where people play. That's just not going to happen. So I think there needs to be some serious conversations about this whole issue of stormwater utility, which City of Decatur is talking about, but also how to mitigate the impact by requiring developers who are taking out the trees, and it's not an unreasonable request to look seriously at the problem that they are creating when they take out all of the trees and cover it all with impervious surface without giving any real thought or consideration to where that stormwater is going. And grass is not the answer either. Because it's very, grass becomes compacted and hard and it almost acts as concrete. So all I'm saying is that we have a big problem here with stormwater. Every city does. They have a big problem with infrastructure. Infrastructure is important. Nobody wants to pay for it. Government's not. So it's going to end up in higher water and sewer bills. The public is that's the pass-through. That's where the cost is going. Whether you do something about it or you don't, that's where it's going.
Sorry, I lost the question.
While he's looking over, a thought occurred to me. I think the city is in the middle of a stormwater master planning effort, and as it should be. But to really understand how to protect the forest, I think we need a sort of forestry master plan. Most of the premises of the ordinance, as I understand it, come from sort of inherited numbers that are old. And I don't know the basis of those numbers and at what point has a comprehensive study been done of, how much forest really do we have to protect, where is it critical, how are we going to do it, approached in a professional manner, rigorously, in the same way that you would study stormwater. That could inform our ordinance process and our regulatory process in a way that would, I think, be rational and not just emotional.
I'd like to just add something to that. Whereas a lot of times, watershed or arborist department typically operate in silos. And what we need to do, all these things are integrated. It's like going to the doctor, and our heart doctor gives us a medication that actually compromises what our lung doctor is trying to do. And I think we need to approach it holistically and work for sustainable solutions. And that we talk about sustainability a lot, but we see it in our master plans, we see it in our overarching goals, but we don't see it where the rubber meets the road in the code. We got to get sustainability into the code.
many of us, if not all of us, grew up thinking that whatever is on our private property, we can do with whatever we want. So if I don't want that tree, I could just be able to take it down. It's on my property. But trees have benefits that extend beyond the private lot. They have a public benefit. And if I live next door to someone who's taking down a lot of trees and my yard floods, now, cities are recognizing that there are these impacts. Similarly, just to reinforce, I think, Amy's excellent point in her presentation, when you build at the beach, you have to respect the forces of nature. You can't build and disrupt, the dunes, for example. You have to respect the fact that your land could flood, therefore you build on stilts. So why is that? Why should our urban environment be any different? Why can't we all learn to do that? And I think that's something that I've learned from looking at this issue more closely in this tree ordinance proposed set of changes, is we're all going to have to change. And in fact, we already have been changing. Anyone who says, oh, a builder can't change, a developer can't change, well, that's not true. The way a builder builds a home today is significantly different than 20 or 30 years ago. Codes are changing constantly. There may be incremental changes, but still the net effect is they have to do things differently. And just tell them what they have to do and know that they are not being penalized any differently than anybody else, and they will do it. It's just that simple. And it has to, well, maybe not quite that simple, but there has to be education, there has to be enforcement that's uniform, which has been an issue with the tree ordinances, as was raised here earlier. But it's just, thinking has to change. I just want to add one other thing about stormwater. The city of Atlanta has already had some significant flooding issues in parts of the city, and they spent millions of dollars to fix neighborhoods where homes were being flooded. I don't know if you all have read about that in the news in the last 5-10 years. So the pictures you showed of this exploding manhole, that's not as those issues start to compound in the metro area, people aren't going to put up with their homes flooding. They're going to start suing the city or the county, wherever they live, and they're going to expect that that their government is going to fix that, and that's going to cost millions. And so when we don't incorporate dealing with that at the point that property is getting developed or redeveloped, we're just kicking that can down the road.
Okay, we've got about 4 more minutes now. There was one question that was also clarifying for Catherine. How do you recognize old growth, and what exactly does that term mean?
That's a great question. So in our area, old growth, to me, means it has a connection to that original forest that was on this part of the southeastern United States. In our area, only, less than 200 years ago, right? So the remnants of that forest we can find. How do we find it? We find it by certain species of trees. A lot of times we think they're really large trees, but for instance, post oaks can be an old growth tree at a fairly small size. So size of trees, the location of these trees, oftentimes if we have diverse species on the same property, and then we have indicator species. So the kind of things that we might find in Fraser Forest or Fernbank Forest, or some of the species over there at the edge of Shoal Creek, that forested area, we can look on the ground and we can find certain native species that their seeds are not blown by the wind, the seeds are not carried by wildlife. Those plants are the offspring of the plants that have lived on that property for thousands and thousands of years. So there are certain clues on how we can find old growth. I'd be happy to talk about that more in detail if anyone would like.
Okay, there are a number of questions here of people who want to take action in different ways. So I'm going to sort of encapsulate some of those. and ask two questions, which is, what do you think about the recent proposed changes to Decatur's tree ordinance? And what would be the one change to the current tree ordinance that would have the biggest potential positive impact on trees and the environment?
Okay, I am fairly familiar with a number of the proposed changes. There are a couple of good changes. I think there's changes to boundary trees, which is actually pretty good. From what I have read, at the moment, most of the changes that have been proposed don't really change the current tree ordinance of how it is now. There's a lot of detail in that, but as Amy had pointed out, there was a requirement to maybe go up to 35% canopy, but at the same time, there's another little clause that got added in that you can count your larger trees twice, which actually brings that down to about 12%. So, and the highest that it would possibly be is about 35%, even though it really isn't 35%. It's also measured in canopy, just to give an idea of how confusing that could be. If you have a large tree in the back of your lot and the canopy extends from the buildable area into the setback, then you have to calculate the amount of canopy in the setback, the amount of canopy in the buildable area, but you get twice the credit for the amount in the buildable area. How do you add that all up? And then it's actually the discretion of the arborist of how to figure that all out. So the regulations are very vague, and I would say complicated, needlessly so, and the enforcement of them has a lot of discretion, so that there's a lot of may. You may have to build around this. You may not have to. I would say that the Decatur ordinance recommendations in their current form are less clear, more complicated, and less exacting than in most other jurisdictions. And the adherence to the concept of canopy makes it more confusing. I don't know how much more detail I should go into, but basically it's not doing a whole lot compared to what Decatur has now. Right now, on most lots, we're losing, I would say, legally taking, about 75 to up to 80 or 90% of the trees on lots is legal now. The changes that have been proposed will not change that significantly.
I was going to take that question.
I think there are simple answers. You should not be allowed to, for any reason that you so choose, remove 3 trees in 18 months. That's increasing to 24 months. It's still 3 trees that might take a human lifetime to reach maturity, full maturity. 25% is not enough. 35% is enough. If your goal as a city is to have 50%, and about 80% of the trees in the city are on private property, then the percentage to be maintained on private property has to go up. It's simple math. So the goal needs to be established more rationally, perhaps through a mechanism of some kind of study, as I was referring to earlier. But the private property requirements would need to be at least in keeping with what the city's goal is. If the city has a goal of 50%, well, then the least you can do is 50%. I would imagine.
So the last question that came up in terms of activism, which a lot of these are, is what can we do as resident citizens?
I always come down on the side of a strong leader to push your issue or any issue. Bureaucracies are, by their very nature, incredibly slow, incredibly convoluted, incredibly non-decisive. And to put these kinds of decisions squarely in the hands of folks who, I'm not being disparaging about it, I'm just saying that's what they do, that's who they are. And I made the same comment in the city of Atlanta. about the city of Atlanta. They have spent a whole lot of money on something that's called the ecological framework. They have a national consulting firm they brought in from from Charleston, South Carolina, to do it. And I've made many comments. I've had several meetings with the group, and they ask me about, what do you think about this and you think about that, and I tell them. So let me ask you a question. Where is the mayor on this? Because if she's not for it, it's not going to happen. And I say that here because it takes leadership. It takes someone with a vision who sees the benefit of all we talked about. That's, if you get whomever, the mayor, the city manager, whomever it is, indicator, in a room like this and say, let's talk about how we're going to fix this problem. Because the arborist can't fix it. It's going to take something more.
Yeah, I would say that, the four-step plan is a very good model to operate on. You have to have sort of a vision of how to get from here to there. So first of all, you have to agree to where there is. And if City of Decatur wants to retain 50% of its canopy, and a lot of that needs to be in its existing trees, how do you get there? The four-step plan really works on how to get there. And this has been vetted by developers and builders. It can really work. And so I think that what we need to do is sit down. I would recommend maybe a work session and really explain step by step by step how this works, and have citizens who are interested and staff and decision makers all kind of sit down and look at it. That would be my recommendation.
I apologize to those of you that submitted questions that we didn't get to, but the panelists will be around if you want to ask those questions later. Please join me in thanking the panelists. And thank you for coming and asking questions.